So, have you ever looked at something, say a sunset painting, and found yourself wondering, is the way you experience that particular shade of orange the exact same as the way I do?
Hmm.
We both see orange, we agree it's orange, but is the private, subjective feeling of orangeness the same inside your head as it is inside mine?
Well, that's the classic question, isn't it?
Actually.
Gets right to the heart of subjective experience. For centuries, philosophers have, wrestled with this. They often call it qualia.
Qualia, right. Those private conscious qualities, feeling, seeing, tasting.
Exactly. The redness of red, the taste of chocolate, that feeling of warmth, all that internal stuff.
And traditionally, the main view, right, pushed by some big philosophical ideas,
Yeah.
was that these qualia, they were essentially locked away. Science couldn't really touch them.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Think of Thomas Nagel's famous question, what is it like to be a bat?
Ah,
His point wasn't just about bats, specifically. It was that even if you somehow knew every single physical detail about a bat's brain,
yeah.
how its sonar works, the firing patterns, all of it, you still wouldn't know the subjective experience.
What it feels like.
What it feels like to be that bat. That internal feeling was considered, well, beyond scientific reach.
And David Chalmers captured this too, didn't he, with his hard problem of consciousness.
Mm.
He basically said, look, we can explain the mechanics of the brain,
Mhm.
okay, how neurons fire, how information is processed.
It's physical processes,
But
yeah.
that doesn't explain why any of it feels like something. Why is there an inner subjective experience at all?
Right. And those ideas really cemented this notion that qualia were fundamentally different, maybe like forever opaque
Yeah.
to actual measurement.
And this is where it gets really interesting based on the sources we're looking at today.
Yeah.
That perspective might be shifting, quite dramatically, actually.
Yeah.
Because, hang on, if experience is happening in the brain,
Okay.
and we can measure brain activity, right? Using tools like fMRI.
That imaging tech, yeah, shows brain activity.
Exactly. Then maybe, just maybe, we can start to find ways to objectively study those subjective states. Maybe even compare them across different brains.
So challenging that old view head on, can we find objective, measurable things happening in the brain
Uh-huh.
that actually correspond to these subjective feelings? And if we can, how similar are they from person to person?
And that's really our mission in this deep dive, isn't it? To explore this cutting edge. The research suggesting it might now be possible to objectively measure qualia, or at least get a really good approximation.
Based on this new study and some related ideas, yeah.
So let's jump into that recent scientific study first. It sounds pretty straightforward in its setup. 35 participants?
Yeah, 35 people, and basically they were shown different colors. Simple as that.
Reds, blues, greens, standard stuff.
Standard stuff, yeah.
No.
But while they were looking at these colors, their brain activity was being monitored using fMRI. And the big question they were trying to tackle was, okay, if two different people look at the color red, does the pattern of brain activity linked to that experience look similar between them? Or is it completely different?
Oh, so trying to find like a shared neural signature, a brain pattern for redness or blueness that holds up across different individuals.
Precisely. That was the goal. And, what they found was pretty significant.
What did they find?
They actually discovered measurable similarities in the brain signals that corresponded to perceiving the same colors across those different participants.
Really? Similarities?
Yeah. Now, it wasn't like identical down to the last neuron or anything.
Okay, sure. Brains are complex.
Right. But there were consistent, objective patterns linked to specific color experiences that showed up similarly in different people's brains.
Wow. Okay, that feels like, well, a potentially huge step, doesn't it?
It does.
Because this is being presented as maybe the first time scientists have found a way to put an objective measure on something we all thought was purely subjective.
Right.
By finding these shared neural signatures for seeing, say, red, they're basically arguing they've, in a sense, measured qualia.
That is the claim, yes. Finding a physical correlate, something happening in the brain tissue that is consistent enough across people to suggest, well, maybe the underlying experience is also pretty consistent.
So that age-old question, is your red the same as my red? This study suggests the answer might be yes, sort of.
Well, yeah, the study's finding is phrased quite carefully, as you'd expect. They say that your red is at least structurally and approximately likely indeed the same as my red.
Okay, structurally and approximately likely. That's quite specific.
It is. It acknowledges the complexity, right? It's not claiming perfect identity, mind you. But it's saying that the underlying neural structure, the pattern of activity tied to seeing red, is measurably similar enough across different brains. to suggest the subjective experience is also broadly similar. Like they found a kind of universal language for color perception and brain activity patterns.
Okay, that is genuinely huge. It shifts the whole conversation from unknowable to, well, maybe measurable after all.
Mm-hmm.
And this study, it's not just some isolated thing, right? It seems like it's part of a bigger trend.
Absolutely. This research fits right into a broader, really exciting movement in neuroscience and philosophy too, actually. It's a push to take consciousness, subjective experience out of just abstract debate and see if we can actually apply scientific methods to understand it, maybe even quantify it.
And there's a really interesting theoretical idea that seems to fit well with this kind of study. The sources mention work by Anil Seth and colleagues.
Ah, yes, Anil Seth. His work on predictive processing.
Predictive processing.
Yeah.
Right? They're proposing a mathematical framework for consciousness and qualia based on that.
Exactly. The core idea is that the brain isn't just like passively soaking up information from the senses.
Okay.
It's constantly making predictions about the world based
Mhm.
on everything it's learned and experienced before. It's an active process.
So it's like my brain is always guessing what I'm about to see or hear or feel?
Pretty much. It generates an internal model, predicts the sensory input it expects based on that model. Then, crucially, it compares that prediction to the actual sensory data coming in from your eyes, ears, skin.
And if there's a mismatch, if the guess was wrong.
If there's a difference, a prediction error, the brain updates its internal model. It learns, basically. It tries to reduce that error next time, make better predictions.
Okay, I think I follow that. So prediction, comparison, update. But how do qualia, the subjective feelings, fit into this?
Well, within this framework, qualia are seen as, and this is a quote, key elements of this predictive algorithm.
Key elements.
They're like the fundamental building blocks or the variables the brain uses to describe and predict sensory information really efficiently, really flexibly.
Can you give an example?
Sure. The sources mention color like red or blue. That's a very efficient way for the brain to categorize complex visual input, right?
Yeah, simplifies things.
Or another example they give is the feeling of your body's orientation. You just know if you're standing upright or hanging upside down.
Mm.
That feeling is a kind of high-level summary generated by this predictive system.
So qualia are like useful shortcuts or summaries in the brain's prediction game.
That's one way to think about it, yeah.
Okay.
They're part of the machinery the
Yeah.
brain uses to model and interact with the world.
So the argument then is, if we can figure out the mathematical structure of this whole prediction and correction process, we might be able to understand and maybe even map subjective experiences like color in a structured way, similar to how that fMRI study did it empirically.
Precisely. It's trying to get at the underlying computational logic of feeling. What is the structure of experience itself?
And this isn't just like theoretical papers or one-off studies anymore. The sources mentioned there are even dedicated organizations working on this.
That's right. The Qualia Research Institute, for instance. Their stated goal is explicitly to create a precise mathematical framework for understanding subjective experience. They actually talk about wanting to map the state space of consciousness.
Map the state space. What does that even mean?
It sounds like they want to create a kind of map of all possible conscious experiences, all the different ways things can feel and understand how they relate to each other mathematically.
Like a landscape of experience.
Exactly. Understand the landscape of experience, as they put it.
Wow. That's ambitious. A wild concept, really.
It absolutely is. It's trying to bring a level of mathematical rigor to our inner world that, frankly, was pretty unthinkable not that long ago.
And what's really fascinating is that even philosophy, the field that traditionally kind of walled off qualia from science, even philosophy seems to be shifting a bit.
Yeah, the sources point that out, too. There seems to be a reevaluation happening even there. They mention a new book, The Metaphysics of Color, written by two philosophers.
Okay, the metaphysics of color. What's their angle? Is it defending the mystery?
Surprisingly, no. They actually argue that colors are real properties of the world.
Real, like out there, not just in our heads.
That seems to be the thrust of it.
Yeah.
And they argue there's no good reason to consider colors less objective than something like, say, temperature.
Huh. So they're pushing back against the idea that color experience is purely subjective, just locked inside the head.
Seems like it. Challenging that very notion.
Okay, so let's piece this together. We have science finding objective neural correlates for color experience.
Right, the fMRI study.
We have theoretical frameworks trying to map the computational process of experience using predictive processing.
All Seth and others.
We have research institutes trying to mathematically map the entire landscape of experience.
The Qualia Research Institute.
And now even some philosophers are questioning the purely subjective nature of things like color.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what does this all point to if these researchers are really onto something? If we are figuring out how to measure and understand subjective experience objectively, what happens next?
Well, if they're right, then we could be, potentially, standing right at the threshold of a completely new understanding of what it means to experience anything in any kind of system, biological or maybe even artificial someday.
And the potential implications, I mean, if this line of research keeps going and actually succeeds, they seem pretty profound.
Oh, absolutely.
The sources raise the idea that understanding how experience happens, well, that might eventually lead to understanding how to create it.
Yes. Moving from just understanding it to maybe synthesizing it.
Or even, and this sounds like science fiction, the possibility of being able to somehow share experiences directly, brain to brain.
With other people.
Yeah.
Or potentially even, other creatures.
Which brings us to that really provocative, almost unsettling example the source material throws out there.
Yeah.
Who wouldn't want to know how it feels to breed a new human pandemic?
It's a jarring example for sure.
It really highlights the extreme, maybe even dangerous boundaries this kind of understanding could push against, doesn't it?
It certainly does.
Yeah.
It's a stark illustration of the kind of power and maybe strangeness that could come with truly understanding and perhaps manipulating subjective experience itself.
Okay, so wrapping this up, we've taken a deep dive today into one of the most fundamental mysteries out there, the nature of our subjective experience, these qualia. We've seen how new scientific studies are finding objective ways, like with fMRI and color, to measure something previously thought completely off limits.
Yeah, cracking the door open.
And how theoretical frameworks are trying to mathematically map the whole process, while even philosophical views seem to be evolving alongside the science.
It really suggests that the hard problem might not be quite as hard, or at least not as impenetrable as we once thought. We might be getting closer than we realized to understanding the very fabric of consciousness.
So the final thought maybe is, if science can truly start to quantify the texture of our subjective world, find the brain patterns for red or map that landscape of experience, what does that ultimately mean for our deepest sense of self, our individuality?
That's the big question.
And looking forward, what unimaginable new forms of connection, or maybe just understanding, might that unlock between us or perhaps even with other minds entirely?